My pulse didn't move. That was the strange part, the thing I keep returning to. Theo Marchand stood at the front of the all-hands and told 400 people that Calderon Re had evolved beyond the era of indispensable individuals, and somewhere in the third row, I felt my own heartbeat stay exactly where it was, even, unbothered, like a needle resting flat. I had spent 14 years learning to read a storm before it formed. The faint pressure drop that says something is coming while the sky still looks ordinary. So I knew, watching his mouth shape those careful words, that he had just walked into weather he couldn't see. He thought he was retiring a risk. He was creating one. I picked up my pen and wrote 4 words in the margin of my notebook, and then I waited for the room to empty. The badge still worked. I remember testing it that morning, pressing it to the reader outside the 14th floor risk suite at Calderon Re Holdings, half expecting the light to blink red the way everything else in my professional life had quietly started blinking red over the previous 8 months. But the light went green. The lock clicked. The door opened the way it had opened every morning for 14 years. It struck me, standing in that doorway with my coffee going cold in my hand, that they had stripped me of nearly everything except the things that actually mattered, and that no one in the building seemed to understand the difference. My name is Yelena Sokolova. For 14 years, I was the person who decided what a hurricane was worth. That sounds dramatic, so let me make it precise. Calderon Re is a reinsurance company. We insure the insurers. When a coastal carrier in Florida sells 100,000 homeowner policies, they don't actually want to carry the full risk of a Category 4 making landfall in the wrong county, so they buy protection from a company like ours. They pay us a premium, and in exchange we agree to absorb a slice of their catastrophe losses. The entire business comes down to a single, almost unanswerable question. What is the right price for a disaster that hasn't happened yet? Get that number wrong in one direction, and you lose every deal to a competitor who priced it cheaper. Get it wrong in the other direction, and one bad storm season erases a decade of profit in 11 weeks. The whole company, 400 people, $3 billion in capital, an 86-year-old name on the building, balanced on the quality of that one number. And for 14 years, that number was mine. I had built the thing that produced it. When I joined Calderon Re, I was 33, recruited out of a federal modeling group by a man named Bernardo Calderon, the grandson of the founder, the last of the family to actually run the place. Bernardo was old by then, courtly, precise, the kind of man who wore a pocket square without irony and remembered the name of every analyst's spouse. The company was profitable but sleepy, still pricing catastrophe risk the way it had in the 1990s. Industry standard vendor models, a few seasoned underwriters' instincts, and a great deal of hoping. Bernardo knew it wouldn't survive the next decade that way. Climate volatility was breaking the old assumptions. Storms were arriving where the historical tables said they shouldn't. The 100-year flood was showing up every 6. He brought me in and said something I have never forgotten. He said, "I don't want you to improve our model. I want you to throw it away and build me one that tells the truth." So I did. It took me the better part of 3 years. I called it the Sokolova surface, not out of vanity, but because the name stuck before I could stop it, and after a while it would have been stranger to rename it. The vendor models everyone else used treated catastrophes as roughly independent events drawn from a historical distribution. Mine didn't. Mine modeled the correlation structure between perils, the way a wildfire season dries the watershed that then floods catastrophically when the atmospheric river finally arrives, The way a warming Gulf doesn't just make one hurricane worse, but reshapes the entire seasonal probability field. It treated the planet as a coupled system instead of a lottery. It was, I'll say plainly, years ahead of anything our competitors were running, and it was the reason that by my 8th year, Calderon Ray was winning treaties we had no business winning and losing money on almost none of them. The model was the company, not a tool the company used. The company. Bernardo understood that completely. In those years, he put me in front of clients, in front of the rating agencies, in front of the board. When the chief actuary of a major primary carrier wanted to challenge our pricing, Bernardo would smile and say, "You should talk to Yelena," and then he'd let me dismantle their objections one curve at a time. I was never hidden. I was the foundation, and everyone who needed to know knew. Then Bernardo's heart began to fail, slowly and then all at once, and the family decided they were done running an insurance company. They sold their controlling stake to a private equity consortium called Vireo Partners, and Vireo installed a CEO. His name was Theo Marchand. He arrived in a charcoal suit that cost more than my first car, with a vocabulary built entirely out of words like scalability and single points of failure and institutionalizing knowledge. And within a week of his arrival, I understood that he and I saw the company through two completely different windows. He looked at Calderon Ray and saw an underpriced asset with bloated headcount and an inefficient cost structure. He saw a thing to be optimized and flipped in 5 years. He did not see weather. He did not see the surface. He saw a line item called risk and analytics that, in his words during our very first one-on-one, was expensive relative to peer benchmarks. I sat across from him in his newly redecorated office, Bernardo's bookshelves gone, replaced with a single enormous abstract canvas in corporate beige, and I tried to explain what the peer benchmark didn't capture. The peers are cheaper because their models are worse, I said. We win the good treaties and decline the bad ones because we can actually see the difference. That edge is the company. Theo gave me a smile that I would come to know very well. It was patient, faintly amused. The smile of a man who has already decided the conversation is over and is simply waiting for you to catch up. "Yelena," he said, "every founder-era company believes its magic is irreplaceable. Part of my job is to prove that it's a process, not a person. That's not an insult. It's how value gets built." I remember walking back to the Risk Suite that afternoon and standing at the floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out at the harbor 12 floors down, the container ships stacked like a child's blocks, the gray autumn light flattening everything. I remember thinking, he doesn't understand what he just told me. He thought he'd issued a challenge. What he'd actually done was describe, out loud, his plan to remove the one thing holding the building up, and he believed that doing so would make him look strong. The first year wasn't open warfare. It rarely is. The first year was erosion, and erosion is quiet. It started with the meetings. Theo restructured the pricing review committee, the weekly session where we decided how to price the largest treaties, and streamlined it, which meant he removed 3 of the senior analysts who reported to me and replaced the open technical discussion with a presentation format. I used to walk into that room and watch 8 people argue about a Gulf Coast wind curve until the truth fell out of the disagreement. Now I walked in to find Theo arriving with conclusions and using the hour to narrate them. Then came the hire. His name was Casper Lindqvist, and Theo brought him in as Head of Modeling Transformation, a title that had not existed before and described a job that, as far as I could tell, consisted of building slide decks about my work. Casper was not a stupid man. He'd run analytics at a consumer credit firm, and he understood data pipelines and governance frameworks and all the vocabulary of modern quantitative management. What he did not understand, what he could not have understood after 6 months or 16, was the surface. He understood that it produced numbers. He had no feel at all for why the numbers were right. Within a quarter, my analysts were told to dotted line into Casper for modeling governance. Within 2 quarters, my budget for the external data feeds, the satellite sea surface temperature sets, the proprietary atmospheric reanalysis I used to recalibrate the correlation structure every season, was flagged as redundant with our vendor relationships and cut by 60%. I fought it. I wrote a 4-page memo explaining that the vendor feeds Casper wanted to rely on were exactly the feeds whose blind spots my model existed to correct. The memo went into Theo's inbox and, as far as I ever knew, into nothing. I still had my title, Chief Risk Officer. I still had my office on the 14th floor, my name in the directory, my badge that opened every door. What I no longer had was any actual authority over the one thing I had spent 14 years building. I had become, in the polite architecture of corporate decline, a consultant on my own creation, invited to the meeting where the decision had already been made, asked for input that would be thanked and ignored. And here is the part that mattered, the part Theo never knew. Every single morning, before any of it, I was still keeping the surface alive. Because a catastrophe model is not a building you finish and walk away from. It is a living thing. It drifts. The world it describes keeps changing underneath it, and if no one is recalibrating the correlation parameters as the actual ocean warms and the actual storm tracks bend, the model slowly, invisibly, begins to lie. Not all at once. Just a few basis points of error here, a slightly miscalibrated tail there, nothing that shows up in a quarterly report, everything that shows up the day a real storm makes landfall, and the loss comes in 3 times what the price implied. I had been doing that recalibration quietly, in the margins of a hollowed-out job, using access nobody had thought to revoke, drawing on judgment that lived in exactly one place on Earth. It was the 2nd week of October when Theo's assistant sent the calendar invite. All hands, mandatory, main auditorium. The subject line said Calderon Re 2.0. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and looked out at the harbor, where the light had that particular pewter quality it gets before the season's first real storm, and I felt the pressure drop. Pack the legacy. We're building Calderon Re 2.0. That was the sentence Theo Marchand opened with, standing center stage in the main auditorium with a wireless mic clipped to his lapel and a slide behind him that said exactly those words in a sans serif font Vireo's brand consultants had no doubt charged a fortune for. 400 employees filled the tiered seats. I was in the 3rd row, on the aisle, my notebook closed on my lap. Casper Lindqvist sat to Theo's left in the front row. 2 members of the Vireo-appointed board sat in the back. I recognized them. A woman with silver hair pulled into a severe knot, and a younger man who spent the whole meeting looking at his phone. Theo was good on a stage. I'll give him that. He had the cadence of a man who'd been coached, the practiced pause, the way of dropping his voice on the important words so the room leaned in. He spent the first 10 minutes on the numbers, which were genuinely good, premium volume up, combined ratio holding, Vireo's people in the back nodding along. He talked about the company's 86-year history with the warmth of a man describing a building he intends to demolish. Heritage, foundation, the shoulders we stand on, the vocabulary of respect deployed in the service of replacement. Then he said the words, organizational evolution, and I felt the room change temperature. because everyone who had survived more than one of these knew what that phrase meant. For most of this company's history, Theo said, our catastrophe pricing has depended on a small number of highly specialized individuals. That was appropriate for the company we were. It is not appropriate for the company we're becoming. Genius doesn't scale. Process scales. So we are institutionalizing our modeling capability, moving from a model that lives in a few brilliant heads to a governed, documented, transparent platform that the entire organization can trust and audit. He never said my name. He didn't have to. 400 people knew exactly whose head he was talking about, because 400 people had spent years being told by Bernardo and by the sales team and by the rating agencies that the Sokolova surface was the reason their bonuses existed. He described the new structure. The Chief Risk Officer role, my role, would be refocused on client-facing relationships and regulatory certification. All actual model development and calibration authority would consolidate under Casper's modeling transformation function, elevated to a full platform mandate. It was a coup announced as a reorganization, delivered to the victim in a room of 400 witnesses with a slide deck. He opened the floor for questions. I raised my hand. He saw it. Of course he saw it. I was on the aisle in the third row. He let his eyes pass over me the way you pass over a chair. We're tight on time, so let's hold questions, he said. Catch me after. I kept my hand up. A few people noticed. I watched it ripple. The small turns of the head, the awareness moving through the rows that something was happening, that the woman whose name nobody had said was sitting there with her hand in the air and her face perfectly calm. Theo's smile tightened by a degree most people wouldn't have caught. I caught it. Reading the thing before it fully arrives is the only skill I have ever truly had. He decided, I think, that ignoring me would look weaker than addressing me. So he addressed me, and I have replayed his exact words enough times that I can give them to you precisely. Yelena. A warm pause. A small spread of the hands. Your contributions to this company's foundation are part of our story, and they always will be. But the entire point of what we're announcing today is that no single person should ever be the rate-limiting factor for an 86-year-old institution. We are bigger than any one model. I genuinely encourage you to lean into this evolution rather than against it. And then, the line. The one that told me he believed his own performance. The cemeteries, he said, smiling, are full of indispensable people. A laugh went through the front rows. Not a big laugh, a nervous one, the kind that escapes when people are relieved the lightning didn't strike them. Casper Lindqvist laughed. The board member in the back glanced up from his phone and then back down. And the rest of the room, the analysts who reported to me, the underwriters who had sat in pricing committee and watched me find the flaw in a treaty that would have cost us $40 million, the people who knew, the rest of the room looked at their laps. That was the part that stayed with me. Not Theo. Theo was exactly what I had understood him to be from the first week, and you cannot be wounded by a man behaving in character. What lodged under my ribs was the silence of the people who knew better. The careful, downward, self-protective silence of 400 people deciding, in real time, that watching me be erased was safer than acknowledging it. I lowered my hand. I opened my notebook, and I wrote 4 words, the same 4 I'd written that morning, pressing the pen down hard enough to dent the page beneath. Let the system drift. Then I closed the notebook and waited for the meeting to end, the way you wait out the front edge of a storm you've already priced. I did not go to Theo afterward. I went back up to the 14th floor, and I sat at my desk, and I did something that looked, to anyone glancing through the glass wall, like a woman quietly catching up on email after a hard meeting. I opened the calibration console for the Sokolova surface. It opened. Of course it opened. No one had revoked my access, because revoking my access would have required someone to understand that I still had my hands on the living machine, and not one person in Theo's new structure understood that. The console showed me the current state of the correlation surface across every active treaty in the book. And because I had been tending it every single morning for 14 years, I could read it the way a doctor reads a chart, and I could see the things that were already starting to go wrong. There were 3 of them. The first was a drift in the Gulf wind surge correlation, a parameter that governed how we priced the interaction between hurricane wind damage and storm surge flooding for our coastal treaties. The vendor feeds Casper had switched us to were running about 4 months stale on sea surface temperature, which meant the model was slowly underestimating surge severity. Nothing visible yet. A real problem by the heart of the season. The second was a recalibration the model needed across our wildfire treaties in the Western Book, where a dry year had shifted the conditional probabilities in a way the static vendor tables wouldn't catch. And the third, the one that made me sit very still, was our single largest treaty. A multi-line catastrophe program for a primary carrier called Helvar Mutual, a $214 million exposure that represented, on its own, almost a fifth of the catastrophe book. The Helvar program was priced on an assumption about correlated multi-peril events that I had personally calibrated and personally maintained every quarter for 6 years. The underlying parameters were beginning to decay. Left untended, by the deep part of the season, the Helvar Treaty would be carrying real risk at a price that no longer reflected it. And Helvar's own chief actuary was sharp enough that their annual model audit, due in the new year, would eventually find the gap. I had been quietly fixing all 3. It was Tuesday. It was the kind of quiet, invisible, uncompensated maintenance that I had done so automatically for so long that I had stopped thinking of it as work. It was simply the thing that kept the lights on. I looked at the console for a long time. The harbor light had gone fully gray now. Out past the glass, the first real front of the season was stacking up over the water. Then I closed the console without touching a single parameter. I was not going to break anything. I want to be exact about that, because there is a line, and I knew precisely where it was, and I did not cross it. I was not going to corrupt a number or sabotage a feed or introduce a single flaw that wasn't already arriving on its own. I was simply going to stop holding back the tide. I was going to stop doing the invisible work that no one had asked me to do, that no one even knew I was doing, that no one was paying me to do. And I was going to let an inadequately understood system do exactly what such systems do when the one person who understands them finally takes her hands off. I was going to let it drift. Let me stop here for a moment, because I think the next part only lands if you understand what I was actually deciding in that chair. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the person who quietly holds something together, a system, a team, a whole company, while the people in charge take it for granted and call it process? Have you ever watched someone publicly diminish you in a room full of people who knew you deserved better and stay silent? Not because you were weak, but because revealing your hand too early would have ruined everything? If you have, tell me one word in the comments. Just one. The word that comes up first when you remember that room. I read every single one of them. And if no one has ever told you that the quiet work you do is the load-bearing wall, consider this me telling you. Subscribe and stay with me, because what Theo Marchand was about to discover is that you can take a person's title, her team, her budget, and her microphone, but you cannot take the thing inside her head. And she gets to decide when she stops lending it to you for free. 11 days. That's how long it took for a multi-billion-dollar reinsurer to discover what one person's attention had been worth. It didn't announce itself. That was the entire point. The thing Theo could never have understood, because he thought of risk as something that arrives with a siren. The Sokolova surface didn't fail. It drifted. And drift is silent until the precise moment it isn't. The first sign came on the 4th day, and it came to me, ironically, through Casper Lindqvist. He appeared at my office door late on a Friday afternoon, which was unusual. Casper preferred channels he could document. He had his laptop open against his forearm like a waiter carrying a tray, and the particular over-casual energy of a man trying to make a real problem sound like a small one. "Yelena, quick one," he said. "The governance dashboard is throwing some variance flags on the Gulf treaties. Probably just a feed sync thing. You wouldn't happen to know the recalibration cadence on the surge correlation parameters, would you? I can't find it documented anywhere." I looked at him for a moment. I want to be honest about what I felt, because it would be a cleaner story if I'd felt triumph. I didn't. I felt something closer to grief. The specific sadness of watching a man stand inside a machine he doesn't know is breaking, holding the manual to a different machine entirely. "It's not documented anywhere," I said. "Right, but the cadence, is it monthly, or—" "Casper," I said gently, "it isn't a cadence. There's no schedule. You recalibrate when the surface tells you it needs it, and reading when it needs it is the entire skill. That's not in a run book. I've tried twice to write it down. Both times I produced 30 pages that were completely accurate and completely useless to anyone who hadn't spent 10 years developing the judgment underneath them." He blinked. I watched him decide that I was being difficult rather than truthful, which is the most expensive mistake a certain kind of manager reliably makes. "Okay," he said, in the tone of a man planning to escalate. "I'll loop in the vendor." "You should," I said. And I meant it, in a way he couldn't hear. Loop in the vendor. Loop in everyone. Watch how far that gets you. Here is what was actually happening. In the engine room, nobody could see. When I stopped recalibrating the Gulf surge correlation, the model kept producing numbers, confident, precise, professional-looking numbers. That's the dangerous thing about a sophisticated model. It never tells you it's lost. It just keeps answering, with the same authority it had when it was right. The staleness in the vendor's sea surface data meant the model was now systematically underpricing the interaction between wind and surge. Every new treaty Casper's team quoted on those coastal accounts went out the door slightly cheap. Not cheap enough to lose money on a calm day. Cheap enough to be catastrophically underwater the day a real storm validated the correlation I'd stopped maintaining. And the season was turning. Out past the harbor glass, the National Hurricane Center had named the season's 7th system, and its modeled track had it strengthening over exactly the warm Gulf water my decommissioned data feeds had stopped watching. I let it run, and I made a phone call. Not a dramatic one. A quiet one, to a lawyer in Seattle named Petra Larrabee, whom I'd met 18 months earlier at a Women in Risk dinner and whose card had sat in my desk drawer ever since, the way you keep a fire extinguisher you genuinely hope you'll never need. Petra specialized in technology and IP employment disputes, the murky, fascinating territory of who owns what a brilliant person carries in their own head. I told her the situation. I told her about the model, the reorg, the all hands, the cemeteries line. I told her I had stopped doing work no one had asked me to do. Petra was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about many times since. "You didn't build them a product they own," she said. "You cultivated a competence they can't. Those are completely different legal animals, and I don't think they have any idea which one they're dealing with. Come in Monday. Bring your original employment agreement and bring everything you've kept." I had kept a great deal. For 4 months, since the spring, when I first understood where Theo was steering, I had quietly assembled a record. Not out of vengeance, out of the same instinct that made me a good modeler. When you sense a tail event forming, you start gathering data before you need it. I had a timeline of every meeting I'd been removed from, every memo I'd written flagging a technical risk, and the silence that followed. Every budget cut to the data feeds with the dates and a contemporaneous note explaining exactly what each cut would degrade and on what timeline. I had, without quite admitting to myself why I was doing it, documented the precise mechanism of my own erasure and the precise consequences that would follow from it. I went to Petra's office on Monday. She read the file for a long time, slowly, the way Bernardo used to read a treaty, with a fountain pen, making small marks. When she finished, she set the pen down and asked me the question that organized everything that came after. "Yelena," she said, "if you walked out the door tomorrow and never came back, how long and how much money would it cost Calderon Ray to rebuild what's in your head?" I had never let myself calculate it out loud. To reconstruct the correlation architecture from scratch. "Without me," I said. 2 years. A team of at least 8 senior modelers who don't currently exist in the market in those numbers. Somewhere between 20 and 30 million in salaries and data and lost time. And during those 2 years, every catastrophe treaty in the book would be priced on a slowly degrading model that no one could properly maintain. Petra wrote a number on her legal pad and underlined it twice. "And the immediate exposure," she said. "Not the rebuild. The thing that's actually on fire right now." I told her about Helvar Mutual, the $214 million treaty, the decaying multi-peril calibration, the annual audit coming in the new year, conducted by a chief actuary sharp enough to find the gap. And I told her about the Gulf storm now spinning up over water the company had stopped watching, threatening to validate every underpriced surge correlation Casper's team had quoted in the last 11 days, in the most public and unarguable way a reinsurer's mistake can ever be validated. A real loss on a real claim that the price never covered. Petra looked at me for a long moment. "You understand," she said carefully, "that you're not threatening to do anything. That's what makes this clean. You've simply stopped doing unpaid, unrequested, undocumented work. The damage isn't something you cause. It's something they've been outrunning for 14 years without knowing they were running." "I know exactly what it is," I said. That afternoon, back on the 14th floor, I saw the first crack reach the surface. An email landed in a distribution list I was still, by oversight, a member of, a thread between Casper's team and the Helvar Mutual account manager. Helvar's chief actuary had asked a question about the multi-peril correlation assumptions in their renewal quote. A specific, pointed, knowledgeable question. The kind of question that has no good answer if the person answering doesn't truly understand the model. I watched Casper's reply go out, confident, fluent, and subtly, fatally wrong. And 3 doors down, through the glass, I could see Theo Marchand standing in his office, phone pressed to his ear, his back to the floor, his free hand pressed flat against the window, very still. The posture of a man who has just been told a number he doesn't understand and has begun, for the first time, to suspect that he should. The storm made landfall on a Thursday. Not the metaphorical one, an actual Category 3 named Odette that came ashore east of where every vendor model had it tracking, over the warm Gulf water nobody at Calderon Ree had been watching for 16 days, and drove a storm surge into 3 coastal counties that our underpriced treaties had quietly assumed couldn't happen at that price. By Friday morning, 2 of our largest primary carriers had filed first notice of loss alerts. By Friday afternoon, the early loss estimate on the Gulf book was running at more than double what the treaties had priced for. And by Friday at 4:19 p.m., my desk phone rang. The internal line. The display said Marchand T. In 14 years, he had never once called my desk. Yelena. His voice had a thin, careful quality, like a man walking on a floor he's just noticed might be ice. I'd like you to come up. There are some questions about the Gulf positions I think you can help with. I'm sure Casper's team has it well in hand, I said. It's their platform now. A pause. I could hear him breathing. I'd consider it a personal favor, he said. My calendar's open Monday, I said. Have your assistant send an invite. And Theo, I'll be bringing counsel. Her name is Petra Larrabee. She'll join by phone. The silence on the line was a different texture than the silence in the all-hands had been. That silence had been 400 people being careful. This was one man doing arithmetic. The meeting happened Monday morning in the 14th floor conference room, the glass-walled one with the harbor view, the same room where 8 months earlier I'd been told the pricing committee was being streamlined out from under me. I want you to hold that detail because I held it. The same long table, the same gray light off the water, the same glass walls through which, during the worst of the spring, I'd watched colleagues study their shoes rather than look at me. This time the room was full, and it was full on my terms. The 2 Vireo board members had flown in overnight. The silver-haired woman was named Margit Holst. She chaired the audit committee, and she had the stillness of someone who had personally watched several companies die and intended to learn from each one. The younger man was Deva Ranja, who ran Vireo's technology diligence. Casper Lindqvist was there, pale, with a laptop he never opened. Theo sat at the head of the table where he was used to sitting. Petra's voice came in clear over the speaker. Theo opened the way men like Theo open, by trying to set the frame. I want to keep this constructive, he said. We've had some volatility in the Gulf book, and Yelena has historical context that I think would help us stabilize. Theo. Margit Holst didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke over him the way you'd close a door. I've read the loss reports. I don't need the framing. I'd like to hear from Ms. Sokolova and her counsel about how we got here and what it costs to get out. She turned to me. Please. Petra spoke first, and she laid it out in 3 movements, cleanly, like a surgeon describing an operation. First, the dependency. She walked them through a 12-page analysis we'd prepared, showing exactly which functions of the Sokolova surface were undocumented and resided in precisely one person's working judgment, the correlation calibration architecture, the multi-peril surface, the seasonal recalibration logic. Not the code, the judgment that told you when and how to use it. Second, the cost to replace it. 2 independent senior modelers, engaged confidentially by Petra over the prior 2 weeks, had estimated the rebuild at 18 to 24 months, and a team of 9, with a conservative budget between $24 and $31 million. during which the entire catastrophe book would price on a model no one could properly maintain. Third, the exposure already in the water. The Gulf losses from Odette, now estimated at $61 million over price. The wildfire treaties drifting in the Western Book. And the centerpiece, the Helvar Mutual Program, $214 million in total exposure, priced on a multi-peril calibration that was decaying in real time, facing an annual audit by a chief actuary who had already started asking the exact questions Casper couldn't answer. If Helvar's audit found the gap and invoked their remediation provisions, Petra explained, the figure would land in the quarterly disclosure. Public. And no serious primary carrier signs a multi-year catastrophe treaty with a reinsurer in the middle of a $214 million remediation dispute. The enterprise pipeline would simply close. Margit Holst read all 12 pages without speaking. Devaranya read them, then looked at Theo for a long, unhurried moment. "I want to understand what's being asked," Theo said. His voice had lost the stage. "It's simple," Petra said. "Yelena is willing to stay at Calderon Re in a role that reflects what she actually does for this company. Full restoration of her authority over the model, a title and reporting line that match that authority, and an equity position that reflects the value she's created and protected for 14 years. In return, she will immediately stabilize the Gulf Book, recalibrate the Helvar program before its audit, and build a genuine, time-funded knowledge transfer program, so this is never concentrated in one person again." "And if the board declines?" Dev asked. "Not hostile, just a man checking the depth of the water." "Then nothing improper happens at all," Petra said. "Yelena continues in her current restructured role, performs her defined duties conscientiously, and the model continues to drift according to its own nature. At the point where Helvar invokes remediation, you'll have $214 million in the quarterly filing, and Ms. Sokolova will have other options." The room was very quiet. Out past the glass, a container ship was working its slow way across the harbor, indifferent to all of us. Then Margit Holst set down the document, took off her reading glasses, and looked directly at me for the first time. "Ms. Sokolova," she said, "why didn't you document this? Properly. Years ago. Surely you understood the risk you were creating." It was the right question, and she deserved the true answer. "I tried," I said. "Twice. The documentation I produced was technically correct and operationally worthless because the model doesn't run on rules. It runs on judgment cultivated against 14 years of real catastrophe data. You don't transfer that with a document. You transfer it with time and an apprentice and patience. And every time I tried to create that time, every time I asked to train a successor properly, the initiative was defunded or the analyst was reassigned to Mr. Lindqvist's team. I did not create this dependency, Ms. Holst. I asked, repeatedly and in writing, to be allowed to dissolve it. I have the memos. They were never answered." Margit Holst turned and looked at Theo. Theo said nothing. "I'll need time." He tried, after a moment, to think through the appropriate reporting structure. "Theo." Margit's voice was almost gentle now, which was somehow worse. "We have a storm in the Gulf, a number with 9 digits coming due, and one person in this building who can stop it. I don't think time is a thing you have." She looked back at me. "Give us 15 minutes, she said. Petra and I stepped out into the hall, to the windows at the end of the floor. We stood there and watched the harbor, and neither of us said much. After a while, Petra said quietly, "You're handling this well?" "I priced it months ago," I said. "I'm just watching the loss come in on schedule." The 15 minutes became 40. When the conference room door opened again, Devarana came to find us himself, which told me most of what I needed to know before he said a word. The board's position, he explained as we walked back, was that the restructuring had been an error, not necessarily in its ambition, but absolutely in its execution and in its failure to understand the technical dependency I represented. He chose his words carefully, the way a man does when he's narrating a decision he intends to be able to defend later. The board supported the full restoration of my authority over the model. It was prepared to negotiate the equity question in good faith, and it wanted the Gulf book stabilized starting that afternoon. The full resolution took 3 weeks to formalize, and it didn't look the way these things look in the cleaner version of the story. There was no single moment of dramatic capitulation, no scene where Theo Marchand broke down at the head of the table. There were lawyers and red-line drafts, and several conversations that ranged from frigid to almost cordial, and the slow grinding work of turning leverage into language. What emerged at the end was this. My title became Chief Risk and Modeling Officer, with the Model Development Authority restored in full and consolidated back under me. My reporting line moved from the CEO to the board directly, a structural fact that mattered more than the title, because it meant Theo Marchand no longer sat between me and the people who actually owned the company. My compensation was rebuilt around a 4-year equity vest on 3.25% of the fully diluted company, with an acceleration clause tied to any sale or public offering. A new governance charter required board approval for any structural change to the catastrophe modeling function, which is to say, the thing that had been done to me in the spring could never again be done to anyone in my seat without the board's signature. Casper Lindqvist was moved to a role overseeing data pipeline operations, which suited his actual strengths, and which he accepted with a grace I hadn't expected and chose to respect. Theo remained CEO. I won't pretend otherwise. Vireo wasn't going to fire the man they'd installed 18 months earlier in the middle of a Gulf loss event. That would have been its own kind of disclosure. But his authority over anything technical was now fenced by a charter provision with my name effectively written into it, and everyone in the building understood the new shape of the floor. I want to tell you the truth about the $214 million because the truth is more interesting than the threat. It was never lost. The exposure was real. I want to be precise about that. The decay was genuine, and the audit was coming, and the number was honest. But I went back to work the first week, quietly, in the margins of everything else, the way I always had. I recalibrated the Helvar multi-peril surface before the audit ever ran. I corrected the Gulf surge correlations and reversed the blunt patch Casper's team had applied. Helvar's chief actuary completed her annual review in the new year and signed off without ever knowing there had been a gap, because the gap was closed before it finished forming. The $214 million was never a sum that vanished. It was a number that made a set of abstract truths concrete, because boards respond to numbers, and lawyers respond to numbers, and Theo Marchand, it turned out, responded to numbers. Sometimes the power of a storm isn't the damage it does. It's that everyone in the room finally believes it's real. Bernardo Calderon heard about it. He was living quietly by then, out past the point where the city thins into coast, and we didn't speak often. But he called me a few weeks after it settled. "I'm told you had a hard autumn," he said. "I had an honest one," I said. He was quiet a moment. "When I hired you, I knew you'd outgrow anything I could give you. I should have built you a structure that protected that from the start. I left you exposed." "You gave me the only thing that mattered," I said. You gave me a blank page and the time to fill it and the trust to do it my way. Not many people ever get that." "Mind the weather," he said. It was a thing he used to say at the end of every board meeting, 86 years of company habit compressed into 2 words. "I always do," I said. There's a question I get now from the other women who've found me since, the analysts and the architects and the quiet load-bearing ones, the people who've watched their work absorbed and their authority filed down to a frequency no one bothers to hear. They ask when I knew I had leverage, and the honest answer is that I always knew. Not because I planned it, not because I was strategic from the beginning, but because I understood what I had built, and I understood that the understanding itself was the leverage. The model was never the asset. The model was the visible shadow of the asset. The asset was the years of judgment that let me look at a drifting correlation surface and know, the way you know weather is changing before the sky shows it, exactly what was about to go wrong. You can put a patent on a balance sheet. You can file a contract in a drawer. But the person who holds the living understanding of a complex thing, who does the invisible work of keeping it true, that person isn't a line item. That person is the ground the building stands on. And ground doesn't warn you when it goes. It simply stops bearing weight, and then you discover what you'd been standing on. On the day I signed the final terms, I sat in the 14th floor conference room. The same long table, the same harbor light, the same glass walls where, in the spring, I'd watched people look away. Theo slid the document across to me. I read it once, fully, the way I read everything. Then I uncapped my pen and signed and slid it back. "I want this to work, Yelena," he said. I looked at him for a moment, and I felt no anger, which surprised me a little. Anger is what you feel when something was taken from you. Nothing had been taken from me. It had only, briefly, been borrowed without asking. "It'll work," I said, "because I'll make it work." That part was never in question. He had nothing to say to that. I looked out at the harbor, the ships, the bridges, the gray indifferent water that had been there before the company and would be there after it. And I thought about what Bernardo always said, "Mind the weather." And I thought about what the model had been built to do in the first place, to see the thing forming while the sky still looks ordinary, to read the pressure drop before the storm has a name. Then I picked up my notebook and went back to work. They can take the title, the team, the room, the microphone on the stage, but they cannot reach the thing inside your head, and in the end, that understanding was the only thing in the building that was ever truly real.